Vultures get a bad rap. They're regarded as bad omens, as harbingers of death or destruction. In reality, they're critical to our ecosystem. Vultures dispose of the gnarliest of pathogens and toxins, including anthrax, and they recycle nutrients for plants to use. They do the dirty work of cleaning up death. And, in the case of Lieutenant Curtis Krueger, they did the dirty work of uncovering a murder. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Before we dig in today, I want to thank Louie's dad for suggesting this case. It was a case I thought I knew the gist of, but I found all kinds of surprises once I started researching. Curtis Krueger enlisted in the United States Marine Corps when he was just 17 years old in 2005. If your ears perked up hearing that a 17-year-old who can't legally enter contracts, vote, or buy lottery tickets enlisted in the Marine Corps, you're on to something. Enlisting at 17 years old is possible, but only with parental consent. In the early 2010s, Krueger began working towards his bachelor's degree in computer science at San Diego State University. Krueger took the Mustang route of enlisted to officer and earned his butter bars, his second lieutenant bars, in 2015. Lieutenant Krueger served as a communications officer and, in 2017, moved to his assignment at Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Center 29 Palms. I'm going to refer to the Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Center as just 29 Palms for the duration of this episode. The full name is a bit of a tongue twister for me. For more background on 29 Palms, Episode 4, the Darnell case, may be a good listen. Now, Krueger had family near the base, and he would spend weekends at their house. From what I can put together, his local family was his aunt, his uncle, and at least one cousin. During the week, Lieutenant Krueger lived in the Bachelor Officers' Quarters, the BOQ, on 29 Palms. Shortly after Lieutenant Krueger arrived in 29 Palms, his family took a trip to Mexico for vacation. Though Lieutenant Krueger visited them on the weekends, he'd be unable to care for the family dog while they were on their trip. Krueger's cousin, Angeline, asked her Jamba Juice co-worker, Ashley Stapp, to feed and walk the family dog. Krueger still visited on the weekend when his family was out of town. Any break from the BOQ was a good thing. It was during that visit that Krueger met Ashley. Krueger was curious about Ashley and consulted his cousin. He wanted to know more about Ashley's situation. Angeline told him that getting involved with her was a bad idea. Angeline told Krueger that Ashley abused prescription drugs and that she was promiscuous. You see, when Ashley was 23 years old, she injured her hip, and she received prescriptions for Norco and Percocet. She became dependent on the drugs and began purchasing the pain pills illegally when her prescription ran out. By the time Ashley and Krueger met in 2017, Ashley's addiction cost her approximately $600 per day. You may have worked out that Jamba Juice was not paying Ashley $220,000 each year, and she turned to other means to feed her addiction. These included stealing pills from her stepfather, getting fronted drugs she'd pay for later, or engaging in sex in exchange for pills. But coming up with the money or some other form of payment was only half of the process. Ashley still needed to find people with pills to sell her. She used Craigslist to meet pill suppliers and sources. She had a few that she relied on. Ashley met Henry Stange on Craigslist. Henry had previously been in a few motorcycle accidents and took prescribed pain pills to manage his symptoms. He tried Norco and gabapentin first, before being prescribed oxycodone. Ashley first contacted Henry to purchase some of these oxycodone pills, and she would travel to his home in Murrieta to make the purchases. To help place it geographically, Murrieta is about 115 miles from 29 Palms. Despite the warning from his cousin, Curtis Krueger and Ashley Stapp began dating a few months after the dog-sitting stint in the fall of 2017. While they were in that honeymoon period, Ashley hid her drug habit from Krueger, not knowing Angeline had already warned him about her prescription abuse. She said that she was interested in Lieutenant Krueger and that he was someone she wanted to have her life together for. About once a month, Ashley would visit Henry Stange. They continued their sexual relationship. Henry introduced Ashley to his ex-wife, his children, his neighbors, and his ham radio friends as Ashley, his 20-something-year-old girlfriend. Henry was 54 years old. Ashley admitted that she manipulated the situation, that she manipulated Henry so that she could have continued access to his drugs without having to pay for them. While Henry told others about his girlfriend Ashley, Ashley introduced Lieutenant Curtis Krueger to her family as her boyfriend. She shared that they'd been discussing marriage. This feels like a totally normal relationship pace for service members, discussing marriage just a few months in. As Ashley and Lieutenant Krueger grew closer, he stopped staying with his family on the weekends. Instead, he would remain on base in his quarters during the week, and on the weekends, they'd camp nearby. And we have really different definitions of camping because I usually compulsively research a campsite, book it, and exchange a few messages with my host to make sure our dog is allowed to come. Ashley and Lieutenant Krueger camped at an abandoned house, which may have been a trailer. References are a little vague. They played house in the abandoned home, squatting there on the weekends. And listen, try as she might to hide her drug addiction, Ashley raised some other red flags for Lieutenant Krueger. He grew concerned after realizing that Ashley struggled to moderate her drinking, but he finally acted after a serious incident of drinking and driving. Ashley disappeared after drinking, and Krueger later found her passed out in her car in the desert. Sure, 29 Palms is remote, but it's not so remote that traffic laws and DUIs don't exist. After that incident of driving into the desert and then losing consciousness, Lieutenant Krueger asked Ashley to share her cell phone location with him. They reasoned that if Ashley got lost like that again, if she was in danger, Lieutenant Krueger could help her. In January 2018, Ashley and Lieutenant Krueger visited her family in Fresno. Ashley looked at her phone, read a message on it, threw it to the ground, and stomped away. The message she read was an email from Henry, her other boyfriend. Lieutenant Krueger responded to Henry's email and told Henry to leave Ashley alone. Otherwise, he'd regret it. On Monday, January 22, 2018, Lieutenant Krueger left the abandoned home they occupied to go to work. He was returning to his midweek reality of the BOQ and his job. But he stopped by the house again during the day, thinking Ashley was still there during the week, and he discovered that she was gone. She'd taken the blankets and the pillows they'd been using to camp with her. When he went to check Ashley's location, he found that her phone was turned off. Lieutenant Krueger called his cousin, Angeline, and told her that he thought Ashley was cheating, and about what he'd seen on her phone in that trip to Fresno. Soon, though, Ashley turned her phone back on, and her PIN showed she was at a gas station in or near Murrieta, 115 miles from 29 Palms. Lieutenant Krueger drove to the gas station to confront her. Upon arrival, and maybe after questioning her about why she was so far from their home, Ashley told Lieutenant Krueger about Henry Stange. But Ashley wasn't ready to be totally forthcoming about her relationship with Henry. Instead of sharing the details of their relationship or saying that she was playing him so she could have continued access to his oxy, Ashley told Lieutenant Krueger that Henry had raped her. This enraged Lieutenant Krueger, and he and Ashley went to Henry's home. Ashley navigated Krueger to the home of her other boyfriend. Ashley waited in the truck when they arrived while Lieutenant Krueger burst in and attacked Henry with a hammer. When Lieutenant Krueger returned to the vehicle, he told Ashley he'd done something bad. The attack was so brutal, Lieutenant Krueger bent the hammer out of shape from the force of his strikes. Lieutenant Krueger later claimed he and Ashley went to Henry's home together to gather her belongings, and that Henry jumped out from behind a couch to try and stop her. Disformed hammer in hand, Lieutenant Krueger drove them back to their abandoned home. Once they got there, he threw the hammer into the desert. But this was still a Monday during working hours, and there were people in his shop waiting for him and wondering where he was. He texted his immediate supervisor, a captain. He told his captain that he was caught up in a family issue, and that he was working the phones with his family because a cousin of his was suicidal. And I have to admit to you, I thought this was the end of Henry's story. While researching, I thought surely the hammer-deforming attack was the cause of death. A 28-year-old Marine bending a hammer while hitting a 54-year-old over the head repeatedly sounds like a textbook definition cause of death. I knew vultures played a part in this story of murder, and I tried to prepare myself to read about their role. The next day, January 23rd, Ashley was worried about the outcome of Lieutenant Krueger's violent outburst, and she returned to Marietta to check on Henry. Fortunately, Henry survived the attack, though he had a serious concussion. He was still bleeding from his ear. Henry told Ashley that he'd been hit over the head with a hammer. But we don't have more details about how their conversation went. We don't know whether Henry knew who his assailant was. We don't know whether Lieutenant Krueger identified himself in that email response or during this attack. We don't know if Ashley divulged who Lieutenant Krueger was. Henry didn't report the incident to the police. And Ashley wasn't the only one battling a guilty conscience. Lieutenant Krueger called Angeline and told her he suspected Ashley was cheating. But after hearing her story of rape, he'd gone to Henry's home and hit him over the head with a hammer. I empathize with Angeline. We've all been in situations where we think our friend or family is dating someone who sucks. We've all had to balance pointing out crappy behavior with being present for our friend when things go sideways. Angeline had already warned Lieutenant Krueger that Ashley dated around and did drugs. Lieutenant Krueger could have seen this coming. He could have walked away from the relationship. But, perhaps because the dating market is small in 29 Palms, Lieutenant Krueger and Ashley stayed together. Ashley agreed to see a therapist, but when she returned from her therapy appointments, her eyes weren't dilated normally. Ashley was still getting high, and it wasn't on cognitive behavioral therapy. Lieutenant Krueger started making notes on his phone to himself and working backward through events that had given him pause. February 2nd, 2018, he wrote that he was a fool for thinking things would work out, because she'd twice cheated on him with Henry for drugs. It seems the allegations of rape no longer seemed plausible to him. On February 14th, 2018, on Valentine's Day, he wrote that Ashley had cheated on him with Henry. He added another note referencing events on December 6th or December 7th, 2017. Lieutenant Krueger noted that back in December, when he hadn't received a reply from Ashley, she was likely having sex with Henry for drugs. March 21st, 2018, he wrote about his continued surveillance of Ashley's phone. And then he sent her a text message asking why she turned her phone off 9 minutes away from Henry's house. Lieutenant Krueger knew just how to keep tabs on his girlfriend. He'd set up auto-forwarding of her emails without her knowledge or her consent. He would reply to text messages without telling her, much like he'd done with that email from Henry in January. And Ashley continued to connect with other new male companions. She lied about where she was and who she was with, and she would turn off her phone to end location sharing. But this bouquet of red flags wasn't enough to dampen their love. In April, Lieutenant Krueger proposed to Ashley, and she said yes. She was still sleeping with Henry, still making new male friends, and still dependent on pain pills. She'd previously said she wanted to have her life together for Lieutenant Krueger, and I don't think this was it. On May 10th, 2018, Ashley attended Jane Wayne Day at 29 Palms to get a taste of what daily life was like for Lieutenant Krueger. During these days, dependents don camis, run a modified combat fitness test, participate in live fire activities, and taste test the best MREs, or meals ready to eat, that the Marine Corps has to offer. I have not taken advantage of a Jane Wayne Day, but I'm more of a Calamity Jane myself. There was a genuinely sweet photo taken of Lieutenant Krueger and Ashley at Jane Wayne Day, applying camouflage paint. Caught in a moment of levity, both are laughing and smiling. I did not look at that photo and guess that 4 months beforehand, Ashley led Lieutenant Krueger to her other boyfriend's house for a brutal attack. Less than 2 weeks after Jane Wayne Day, on May 23rd, Henry emailed Ashley to let her know that he had some oxycodone, and he invited her to an oxy party. As it turns out, this wasn't an invitation to get their whites whiter and brights brighter with OxyClean. On May 24th, the next day, Ashley texted Lieutenant Krueger that she had to pick up some suitcases from her mother's house. Lieutenant Krueger responded, "Suitcases? Seriously? If I find out you're doing drugs." Ashley drove to her mother's house and left her phone there, still broadcasting her location to Lieutenant Krueger. She'd learned that turning it off made him suspicious. No one was home, though, so she had to leave the phone outside. Then Ashley turned back and drove to Marietta to join Henry. And Lieutenant Krueger had his hands full that day. They had a unit event that was hosting family members. Ashley had RSVP'd that, yes, she'd be at the event when it started at noon, but she didn't show. Lieutenant Krueger noted her absence and checked her phone's location. It pinged at her mother's house. To be sure, though, Lieutenant Krueger called Ashley's mother, his future mother-in-law, and learned she wasn't home. She was out of town on a trip to Las Vegas. Sensing something was amiss, Lieutenant Krueger told his supervising major that Ashley was suicidal, and he requested permission to leave and locate her. This was the second time that he cried suicidal ideation, and it sits poorly with me because it downplays the seriousness of actual suicidal ideation. Lieutenant Krueger started the 2-hour drive from 29 Palms to Ashley's mother's home. He contacted 911 and requested a welfare check, telling them he feared his fiancée might be suicidal. A patrol officer didn't find anyone at the house and didn't see Ashley's car. Lieutenant Krueger eventually arrived and confirmed for himself that Ashley wasn't at her mother's house. Then he dialed her phone and found it outside. Lieutenant Krueger updated his major that he'd found Ashley's phone, but had not yet located Ashley. Lieutenant Krueger concluded that perhaps the phone's location and the story about suitcases were all a ruse, and departed for Henry's home in Marietta. He decided to check the one place he knew Ashley had access to drugs, the place where he'd previously attacked Henry Stange in a hammer-bending rage. Krueger resolved to break up with Ashley if she was cheating on him. And isn't that the obvious conclusion? Lieutenant Krueger claimed later that he drove to Henry's house because he feared Henry was raping Ashley. This after typing into his phone repeatedly for months that Ashley was cheating on him with Henry. After telling his cousin that he thought Ashley was cheating on him. After texting Ashley that day saying he better not find out she was skipping his event to do drugs. After realizing that Ashley put the phone in the yard to disguise her actual location while still broadcasting a location. After setting up email forwarding on Ashley's account and probably receiving a copy of Henry's invitation to an oxy party. Driving up to Henry's home, he saw Ashley's car in the driveway. When Ashley arrived earlier at Henry's home, Henry and Ashley took the oxycodone together to get high and then had sex. After, Henry went into his garage where he played music and told his ham radio friends that his girlfriend Ashley was visiting him. While Ashley showered, Lieutenant Krueger arrived and found Henry in the garage. Lieutenant Krueger asserted that Henry told him to come into the garage and then pounced at him with a knife. Lieutenant Krueger claims that he disarmed Henry and stabbed Henry in the neck with Henry's knife. He said Henry fell, then swung at him with a metal disc he found on the ground. Lieutenant Krueger again disarmed him and hit him in the head with the metal disc. Lieutenant Krueger claims Henry, a high 54-year-old wearing only his underwear, having been stabbed in the neck and beaten over the head with a heavy metal object, then kept grabbing at him in a way that was threatening. Lieutenant Krueger admitted to stomping on Henry's head to get away. Ashley, inside the house, finishing up her shower, heard a scuffle and then heard Henry scream. Lieutenant Krueger found Ashley inside the home and told her he'd done something bad and that they needed to leave. As they fled through the garage, Ashley saw Henry bloodied and lying on the floor. They coordinated driving back to Ashley's mother's home where they could leave her car safely while they plotted their next steps. They didn't know whether Henry was alive, but they decided not to contact the police or other emergency services. They knew Henry had security cameras around his property, and they knew they had to cover their tracks. Everything would trace right back to them if police showed up before they had a chance to clean up. Together, Lieutenant Krueger and Ashley climbed into Lieutenant Krueger's truck and drove back to Henry's home. Ashley scrubbed the floor with bleach and, more importantly, stole all of Henry's remaining oxycodone prescription. Lieutenant Krueger grabbed the security cameras and the computer that they downloaded to. Between the both of them, they found and took all of Henry's cell phones. Then Lieutenant Krueger backed his truck up to the garage, and they loaded Henry's body into the bed of the truck. After cleaning the scene and loading Henry into their truck, they departed. At some point in their drive, they stopped and purchased a shovel, presumably storing it in the bed of the truck with Henry's body. Some sources report that they used Lieutenant Krueger's E-tool, an entrenching tool. It's a small tactical shovel issued to the Marines. The record doesn't show whether they stopped to get Lieutenant Krueger's E-tool. But if I had to guess, this is a bit of lore thrown in for drama. It certainly wouldn't make sense to go through base security with a bloodied body in the back of your truck in order to pick up a shovel. They drove the 115 miles from Henry's home to Joshua Tree National Park and entered with their incriminating cargo. And I've given this a lot of thought. Did they enter through a formal park entrance? Did Lieutenant Krueger flash his military ID so they could enter for free? Did the ranger at the entrance thank him for his service and offer him a map, all while Henry's body lay wrapped in their blankets in the bed of their truck? Or did they enter the park by off-roading in an attempt to evade detection? Would that risk drawing even more unwanted attention? Inside the park, they found an area that they deemed to be secluded enough. They dug a shallow grave, placed Henry inside, and hastily buried him. They returned together to the abandoned home they were squatting in. On June 1st, 2018, 2 hikers observed vultures hanging out in an area of Joshua Tree National Park, near a popular campsite. Occasionally, a flock of more than 200 turkey vultures will spend the night at the oasis of Mara during their spring migration. But active vultures are a rare sight in the park. It's the desert. It doesn't have the big game that might normally and regularly attract them. The hikers spotted the shallow grave and exposed bones, and reported both to park authorities on June 2nd. The lower portion of Henry's body had become uncovered and had been subject to animal activity. Sheriff's detectives and U.S. National Park Service rangers started an investigation into Henry's death. But here's the thing. Prosecutors alleged that Henry hadn't died in the garage on May 24th. Instead, he was barely clinging to life when Ashley and Lieutenant Krueger returned, when they loaded him into the bed of Lieutenant Krueger's truck, when they stopped to buy the shovel to bury him with. They believe that when Ashley and Lieutenant Krueger buried Henry Stange in a shallow grave, they buried him alive. Sources don't share an estimate for how long Henry was alive in his shallow grave, nor do they hypothesize how his legs were uncovered. After rehydrating Henry's hands, fingerprints confirmed Henry's identity. He'd suffered multiple blunt force injuries on his head and sharp force injuries or stabs to the left side of his neck. 4 days after his body was discovered, investigators searched his home. There, blood spatters on the underside of the boat in his garage hinted that some of his injuries were stomping injuries. Identifying Henry made it possible to identify Ashley through the numerous people in his life who Ashley had met. Investigators searched Ashley's computer and email and found Lieutenant Krueger. On August 28, 2018, Lieutenant Krueger was arrested near the entrance to 29 Palms. Ashley was arrested the same day on campus at Copper Mountain Community College. But prosecutors didn't file charges within 48 hours and released Lieutenant Krueger and Ashley. Krueger and Ashley and anyone else accused of a crime have a right to a speedy trial. It's unjust to let someone languish in custody without arraigning them. Things were looking up for Krueger and Ashley. Months went by and they were still living lives free from the consequences of their actions. It was beginning to seem like they'd gotten away with murder. But this was as unsatisfying to investigators as it is to you, and on December 7th, NCIS agents and Marietta police detectives presented more information to the district attorney's office. If I had to guess, I would suggest that this additional information was cell phone data from Krueger's phone. The notes section painted a picture of jealousy and love triangles, not fear his fiancée was sexually assaulted. Whatever this specific information was, it was enough to move forward with the case. Lieutenant Krueger was arrested again on December 13, 2018 at Camp Pendleton. He was held on a $1 million bail. The Marine Corps, like Jamba Juice, doesn't pay enough for that kind of bail. Lieutenant Krueger was separated from the Marine Corps, though I could not uncover any more details of his separation. A San Bernardino jury convicted Lieutenant Krueger, now just Curtis Krueger, on September 10, 2020, of assault with a deadly weapon for the January hammer attack and second-degree murder for the murder. Second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter in California is when someone commits murder in the heat of passion. And I think heat of passion is right. It certainly doesn't seem to me like Curtis Krueger departed 29 Palms on May 24th intending to kill Henry Stange. If he'd planned on killing Henry Stange, perhaps he would have brought his e-tool with him. Ashley pled guilty to aiding Curtis Krueger in evading arrest and was sentenced to 309 days in custody and 3 years probation. With credit for time served, that worked out to a sentence of 180 days at a drug rehab center, the Salvation Army Adult Rehabilitation Center in Anaheim. After 137 days at the Salvation Army Adult Rehabilitation Center, Ashley walked out. She left early, she left without permission. But in the time that she was in the program, she'd amassed 14 program violations. These included fraternizing with male participants, possession of contraband, curfew violations, and failing to complete program requirements. Ashley was rearrested and committed to another residential drug treatment program. On October 22nd, the jury sentenced Curtis Krueger to 3 years for the hammer attack and a consecutive term of 15 years to life. He expressed some regret for taking an American's life and destroying a family, a, quote, beautiful American family. For a bit of perspective, if Curtis Krueger had made better life choices, he would currently be less than 2 years away from retirement eligibility. The presiding judge, Judge Kelly Hansen, captured this perspective well and told Curtis Krueger at his sentencing that the life he could have had is gone forever. Krueger will be eligible for parole beginning in 2031. For all the Marines out there listening, I have a safety brief. It's okay to say bye if they're not Semper Fi. I did find one appellate opinion for Curtis Krueger, but it was contesting a jury instruction modification, and I didn't find it particularly interesting. The appellate court affirmed the trial court, and nothing changed in Krueger's sentence. So instead, I want to talk about human trafficking. I saw references in a few articles to this being a human trafficking case, so I thought it might be helpful to discuss what human trafficking is and what it isn't. With all of the myths out there about what human trafficking is, many victims don't even realize that the term applies to their experience. If they see the sign in a restroom that says, if you're a victim of human trafficking and you need help, call this phone number, they won't call because they don't realize the phone number is for them. At the most digestible level, human trafficking is the commercial exploitation of someone else's body, which can be through organ trafficking, labor trafficking, or sex trafficking. Sometimes human trafficking gets mixed up with human smuggling. But human smuggling is providing aid to someone voluntarily seeking illegal entry into a foreign country. Child sex trafficking is specifically what most people seem to think of when they think of human trafficking. And they usually picture a scenario like the movie Taken, where someone is snatched. The vast majority of traffickers operate by building trust with victims and manipulating them into sexual exploitation. Traffickers are most often known to the victim, including their family members and relationship partners. Legal Beagles, I kept finding whispers on the internet that Henry was sex trafficking Ashley, and I couldn't let that go. I actually understand why people might want this to be a case of human trafficking, why it would be easier to believe that a potential hero stepped in to save somebody from the horrors of sex trafficking. I understand why it's tempting to believe that Lieutenant Krueger used the location sharing that he ostensibly set up to protect Ashley in order to actually protect her from something. But that's not what happened. Drugs have a really interesting role in human trafficking on both sides of the transaction. Trafficking adults in California requires force, fraud, or coercion, and sometimes that manifests as chemical coercion. In chemical coercion, a trafficker uses someone's chemical dependence as the means to exploit them, as the way to control them. They may refuse to give a victim the substance they are dependent on until they concede to the trafficker's demands, often until they engage in commercial sex. It's also not uncommon for victims to be kept compliant through the provision of drugs and alcohol. Substances can be one of the many tools in an exploiter's toolbox. Commercial sex itself is sex in exchange for money or something else of value, and that can include drugs. But, and this is the crucial part, not every commercial sex act is an act of sex trafficking. The only commercial sex acts that are de facto trafficking are commercial sex acts by minors, at least in California. In California, the age of consent is 18, and because a minor cannot consent to engaging in sex, they cannot consent to engaging in commercial sex. But an adult can. The force, fraud, and coercion requirement makes the difference under California human trafficking laws. And that's where we can distinguish human trafficking from Ashley's case, at least with the information that is publicly available and on the record. Ashley had previously engaged in commercial sex. She had used sex as payment for drugs when she couldn't secure them by any other means. But that wasn't her arrangement with Henry. In this case, by her own admissions, Ashley wasn't being chemically coerced by Henry. Henry believed that he and Ashley were in a relationship together, to the point of introducing her to his ex-wife and children as his girlfriend. He was a man in his 50s dating a 20-something. Is that not the story of at least a quarter of midlife divorces and midlife crises? Ashley admitted that she manipulated the situation, that she manipulated Henry, so that she would have continued access to Henry's oxycodone prescription. She made Henry believe that they were in a real relationship so that she wouldn't have to pay for her pills. She wasn't engaging in sex as a commercial transaction for the pills from Henry. She was engaging in sex to continue the ruse that she and Henry were in a relationship. Henry wasn't commercially exploiting Ashley's body. He was having a midlife crisis. He was gushing to his friends via ham radio about the woman he was dating, who he thought was out of his league. That's what distinguishes this from human trafficking. That's what distinguishes Henry from a human trafficker. Henry didn't use force or fraud or coercion to make money off of Ashley's body. The only coercion in this case seems to be from Ashley, from everything that we have access to. And I've left myself some wiggle room. I know that I don't know everything that happened in Ashley's life. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. I also invite you to join me in sending the best birthday wishes to my little brother. Bubba, I know you're preparing for a military move of your own, but I hope you take some time to celebrate another spin around the sun. I'm sorry that Tax Day had the audacity to usurp your birthday this year. Join me next time when we don't sell national secrets. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious, Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.